Third-party content has been copied and communicated pursuant to Part 5A or 5B of the Copyright Act, unless indicated otherwise.
Deakin University, Urban Ecologies. Week 2, Architecture and Nature.
Today I will be talking about ecological system and how can we make some sort of comparison to cities and to human ecosystem generally. So I have very little time. I have quite a bit to cover today. So we are going to talk mainly about the relationship between nature and the city. So quickly I will start by saying how to define an ecosystem. You can get this definition everywhere in Wikipedia and everywhere. But we need to understand what it means. So here I refer to the ecosystem as part of the environment that have different interaction in it. And the different interaction would come from biological systems as well as physical systems. So how this all work together? And I would like you to imagine a bit of the environment, select anywhere, select part of a coastal area or a forest or a small system that you create in the lab or a city. I just want you to think of it that way and see what are the actors on this system. There are a physical environment in which these actors operate, which we call abiotic, and there is the biological system, which is biotic, and there is the interaction in between. And how can we study this interaction and what it means to us and to the modification and evolution of the ecological systems? So there are a few figures in this slide. Some of it is about a lake and interaction, because of course you can think of it in a different way. You can think of it as different spheres. So we look into the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere. So you can define it in any way you like, but by the end of the day, it is a number of actors, biological actors, who's interacting with the physical environment around it. And we will try to talk a little bit about that. And I'm more interested in the interaction rather than in the components. And then we'll talk a little bit about energy, because we believe that it will give us a tool to analyze the ecosystem in cities. And then I'll talk a little bit about the history between architecture and nature and development of cities. And then I move into what I'm going to describe as an integral system. Right, what all that means to us, and how can we develop a system that would imitate what's happening in nature. And then I'll talk about urban ecosystem as this relates to one of your research questions. And we'll finish after this. Right. So we talked about ecosystem, and it's important to see how the human ecology have dominated the ecological system. How would that happen, and what are the processes that lead to this domination? So if you look at it, I mean, the obvious way to start is to look into population. So human population increased in size, but also in resource usage. And by doing that, we created new enterprise. So the human ecology, the structure, we create this new agriculture, industry, recreation, and commercial systems. And of course, once we create this organization, this institution in a way, that would affect nature in 3 different ways. The first one is through land transformation. So we, our activities transform land very quickly. We do land clearing, grazing, deforestation, and so on. The second one is through global biochemistry, because we are changing how the cycles of nutrients work in nature. The obvious one, of course, for you is the CO2 increase, but also, more importantly for me, is the nitrogen fixation. Because nitrogen fixation, we have a lot of, you will see some graphs later on this. And the third way that we affect natural ecosystems is through the biotic addition and losses. So it's obvious what's happened here, for example, in Australia, and the introduction of new crops and new animals and so on, and the impact of the ecosystem. So that is a very obvious example for you, but we do that on a large scale in nature. So when we have this sort of stress to nature, that would affect nature again in 2 ways, either in the climate change or in the loss of biological diversity. So that tree of impacts, I would like you to think of how, is it possible to reverse that? Is it possible to change the tree of activities in order to not only minimize, because we are too far into the process now, we don't just want to minimize, but rather to reverse these processes. Is that possible? How many of you, raise your hands now, think it is possible to reverse this sort of structure? Sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Wouldn't it mean like just killing up the population and reducing quality of life and starting our processes again? And
yeah. All right. So that is a very dramatic solution. So one, I just have to repeat it for the off-campus students as well, that the idea here is to get rid of half of the population on Earth and start again. Right? That would reverse it? Not necessary, because what's happening that the other half will continue to start again, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have to reduce the way we live and do things as well at the same time.
Exactly. We need a cultural shift, because you can see the problem here is not the natural resources, but it comes from the human enterprises, for example. We need to look into that and how we can change that and so on. So there is a different way of looking at this. But I just want to know how many of you think we can reverse this process. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Well, this about 2-3% here who believe that we can. That's very optimistic. Yeah. I don't know why I should continue today, but anyway, I'll try. Okay. So third to half of the land surface have been already transformed, and major part of that, and I keep saying that to in every lecture just to remind you, it's us, it's cities, it's the construction industry, is building our houses and roads and transportation. That is about 50% of the reason of this sort of pattern that we would like to change. So you are responsible about all that. Not everybody else, not somebody outside, pixies, which we don't know who they are. It's you. You are responsible about that. Right, I'll move on. I have to be faster a little bit. So here is a graph which shows you this domination of human ecosystems and the difference in percentage of change that we have affected the natural ecosystem. I'm quite interested in the marine fisheries here and the nitrogen fixation. You see, this is the highest that we affect. We are obsessed by the CO2 concentration, which you can see here, which we have changed by about 20%. But there are bigger problems, because the relationship, and all these factors are related as well. So there is a strong relationship, for example, between marine fisheries and nitrogen fixation, because nitrogen fixation is done by microorganisms in the oceans, and then the all the marine biology lived on that, and that would reduce the acidity of the ocean by reducing the pH level, and that's how the whole Earth mechanism is working. So if you change that, you kill the microorganisms here, more nitrogen fixation, more acidity in the oceans, and the whole cycle will be very different. So that we are facing really big trouble here, apart from the CO2. And of course there is also a relationship between CO2 concentration and nitrogen fixation. So all the elements, and remember last time I talked about the fragility of the whole system? And it is like that. So everything is related to everything else, and it's very, very fragile. So it's what's happening now, how Earth is coping with this huge transformation and percentage of changes in every single category is adaptation. Because the system, the ecological system is sustainable in a way. It's a strong system with networks, and once you change the balance, it tries to change it in a different way and balance it again. But there is a limit, and at a certain point that will crack. So why energy is so important? Because that's where everything can run, and also interestingly we can calculate and trace. So we need a way in nature and in our cities to an element of nature that we can trace and see how it works and try to understand and adapt accordingly. And it is energy that through energy we can do that. And here is some figures for you of how we are using energy. Some of these figures are quite interesting. There's a couple of typo mistakes on this slide, so my apologies for those. But you can see that our contribution to primary energy demand is huge through cities, 67%. And of course we exceeded now the population living in cities rather than in rural areas. So this is dramatically increased. We had a meeting this morning and somebody came to talk about, we are buying the energy atlas, the data for all energy consumption and the pattern and perception of people towards energy usage. And he was showing data, and somebody, one of the academics asked whether it's that perception of energy usage is actually lead to behavioral change. And the data doesn't necessarily show that unless you relate that to real energy usage. But I don't have this graph for you today. But one of the very interesting things about usage of energy, there are evidence that we are reducing energy less and more efficient. And we are doing very well. And we try to use more solar energy and more wind energy and so on. But on the other hand, there are two behavioral patterns that we are not changing. The first one, our appetite for energy is growing. So despite the fact we are using less in every single appliances, for example, in our homes and so on, but we are using more of it. We are using more computing, more mobile phones. So our appliances increased, but they are more efficient. So this is the first one. The second one, which is more important for me and hopefully for you as well, our appetite for space is increasing dramatically. The data shows that the household's average per person in the United States, for example, has tripled in the last 20 years. So that's huge. So it doesn't matter how much efficiency you are going to use, you use more space, everything is doubled or tripled all the time. So space, and that is what you do all the time here when you design any building or any public or household. It just we are using a lot of space, and which require, so it changes all the time. So so that's why it is very tricky to reduce energy dramatically. And of course there are data here about the CO2 from energy use and so on. But one thing which I would like to refer to here is that point here, that in the Western world, the per capita primary energy demand in cities are lower than the national average. Do you expect that? So what we are saying here, that cities are much more efficient in the Western world, including Australia and New Zealand, than in rural areas. In a way you expect that, because you expect the houses in the rural areas are not very efficient, they use a lot of transport, they move everywhere, and so on. I mean, one of the data we have, for example, that the Bellarine has the highest percentage of car ownership per capita in, I wouldn't say in Australia, probably in the world. It's incredible data. But so you can expect that. But in China, it is the reverse. So surely, if you think in the developing world, and China is not quite a developing world anymore, but you know the population still live in rural area in a developing world environment somehow. So where did the balance lie? If we are saying that cities are more efficient in the developed world and cities are less efficient in non-developed world, there must be a balance somewhere. And what's going wrong here and why? And this is something for you to find out and have this balance. I would like every one of you, when you do your exercises and so on, to find out why this is the case and what is the balance and how much each cities would cost us. There are ways of calculating this, and hopefully through your reading and research you will find more about this. So how energy works in the system, and that takes us to the laws of thermodynamics. And the very first one, which is very important to us, that energy may be transformed from one type into another, but is never created. We all know that. But it is this principle we need to go back to basics in order to understand how that refer and apply to cities. So every single process, whether it's system 1 and system 2, so you got energy into it, it lose heat and transform the energy into another secondary form, another system 2, lose heat again, and so on. So this is the first one. So for us, materials can be recycled in cities, but not energy, because energy can always end up as heat. The second law is the entropy law, is that no process involving energy transformation will occur unless there is a degradation of energy from a concentrated or concerted form into a dispersed form. We know that as well, right? So the idea here is to minimize the dispersed form of heat. And that's why we look into the efficiency. How many, do you know the solar cell to transform solar into electricity? How many of you have solar cells at home? One. All right. Okay. Do you, for the rest of you, do you know what is the efficiency rate of transformation? Nobody? Well, it differs a lot, but it's around 34%. It's very low. And that means, what did that mean? That means that the rest are going into heat of some sort. We lose it. So the transformation is not very high. But there are a lot of research on making that better. I'm just giving you an example of one system. But think of everything you do, and you find that we are using a lot of systems that are not efficient at all. But this is the natural system here in front of you. So the sun, you can think, is giving us about 5 million kilocalorie per meter square per year. Right? I just jumped from the sun here of how much it produced to us to the end, where we end up with something like what's left is about 40 kilocalorie meter square per year. Where all this energy goes, it goes into ultra-terrestrial, so it's outside most of it. But even when it comes to warm our ecosystem, our Earth, we still receive something around 1 million kilocalorie per year. And then it goes into the autotroph. And this is the interesting thing, the difference between the autotroph and the heterotroph. The autotroph is is the plants and so on who can use energy very efficiently, and the loss of this transformation is very low. So you got systems in nature that have a lot of ability on keeping energy and use it very efficiently. And all the autotroph system in nature, they do that. But then when it goes to the heterotroph, the second, like animals eating plants, the animals and all this, including human beings, are less efficient. So if you think of cities, that we are in that category, but in that category, and we are very inefficient there. I'll come to that later on. But I just want to tell you that we need to go to the basic of how nature works across what is the model of energy movement through the universe, in order to see that there is a lot of energy out there, but how can we make the best out of that? Right, I'll have a break a little bit and talk about something else, and I'll come back to energy later on. Because the relationship between, in order to understand why we are very far from this natural system, particularly in our industries, construction, architecture, landscape and planning and so on, we have to understand how we moved away from nature. Because the relationship between architecture and nature is very ambiguous and very difficult. We have very difficult history with nature. Many architects try to imitate nature and relate to that by mimicking biological system. An obvious example is Gaudi, of course. But the beginning, when we are very close to nature, it continued like that during the prehistory of humankind until the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was basically looking at nature in a very different way. We start to look at nature as a resource of this energy, but it is a raw material out there for us to use. So we can use this depot as we like. And in the Enlightenment area, where the scientific analogy of Francis Bacon and based on Descartes' philosophy is to say nature is really sort of not quite a demon, but it's wild. And we are the people who's through science and through technology that we're going to tame it in a way. That lived with us for a long time, and I think that there's still people around us who believe that. And I'm not trying to make any philosophical stands here, but there are architects around, and you hear that all the time, even through your lectures here, that we look at architecture, for example, as the way to educate society. It's us who knows, and we are going to tell people how to live and how to behave. So that sort of philosophy is still with us somehow. And the Newtonian universe, which is developed in, with Newton and his idea in the 17th century, emphasized that sort of philosophy, that now we will understand science and that will transform our life. And through that time, the idea of aesthetics start to burn. So, you know, nature, we can't get aesthetics from nature. Beauty is in the function. Beauty is in what we can order. Beauty is what we can organize and understand. So, and that is what happened in the 18th century. We start to have our professions start to appear. We start to become the guardians of beauty. So we divorced ourselves completely from nature, and we started to think, all right, we are now can control this. That did not continue for a long time, because through the Industrial Revolution and creation of a lot of misery for human population in Europe, people start to think in another way. So you got a lot of debates between Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc, who promoted the idea that architecture can transform nature, while Ruskin go back to idea of craft and human and spirit and so on. So we started having that dialogue about, no, we are not the ones who through science can transform nature. We are part of nature, which is Goethe with his idea about the holistic universe. So it changed a little bit in the history, during the Industrial Revolution, but it did not transform the profession, particularly in architecture, very much. And then, of course, we moved through the modern movement, who saw the evolution of cities as the main power over nature. And again, during that time, we divorced ourselves completely from nature. And we could not reconciliate with nature until the very recent time. I'm sure in your studio, more in architecture than other disciplines, we still, as educators, we are very much influenced by the modern movement. We have not completely departed from modern movement yet. And that's why I said to you last time, you have a big role in the shaping of cities and the professions for the future, because we have not been able to have this break. Despite the fact you have a lot of sustainability program, and Bob Fuller and many people, and Priya and many people in the school might be talking about sustainability, but when you go to the studio, you start doing something different. You start thinking differently, you're acting differently, while you really like to do something about sustainability, but you have no idea how to do that, apart from drawing some red and blue arrows going up for hot air and turn around and all this stuff, which is so we start to have a very serious debate about that, and we have more serious reference nowadays than we used to, but again, it's not enough. We still live in the modern movement somehow in architecture. Right. And you can see that we still, when we talk about nature and sustainability, there are still our big names in architecture, mimicking and biomimicking nature. So you have here some work of color. It's beautiful work, but it just, I'm just saying to you that we are trying now to move from mimicking forms and so on to seriously engage with nature and understanding the processes for it. Even Zaha, you know, yeah, Daha went once to our students. She said they asked her why anybody would give you. She was at the time she was building the. Well, she won the competition for the festival hall for the Welsh concert hall, and somebody said, "Why we are giving you you know, 100 million pounds to do what you want?" And she just looked at them in, you know, absolute dismay, and she said, "Because I'm Zaha. You know, that's it. I mean, why you are asking the question?" And this attitude, of course, you see it on all signature architects. But even what I'm saying now, even Zaha in her studio, she has a very good studio, Zaha Hadid, and they are doing serious parametric modeling for looking at natural forces and how it affects her form, and she produced a beautiful work. But again, it's looking at forms rather than serious engagement with the with nature. Right, so how that would affect our idea of urban ecosystem and cities? I go back to the energy. We try now to give you some guidance of how to move forward from here. We saw the problem, we saw how nature works, we saw our history with nature in our profession, but how we move forward from here. This is, of course, beautiful pictures of cities at night. I think this is Tokyo, I think. Yeah, Tokyo. It said Tokyo. Right, anyway. All right. So that's, if we would like to compare some of the systems we have, you look at this, and the unsubsidized natural solar system would consume something around 2,000 kilocalories per square kilometer. Unsubsidized natural solar powered ecosystem, you can think of a lot of examples for that. Plants, photosynthesis, and so on. And then naturally subsidized solar power ecosystem like tidal, estuary, and rainforest would use 10 times that. And when we start to have man into the system, that move up to 20,000, and then finally when we have it fuel power urban industrial, we go to 2 million. Big difference here. And of course our cities is a combination of some of those systems, right? So how we move that 2 million figures closer to, say, 20,000. It's possible. So in fuel-powered man ecosystem, we have to think about a lot of variables that affected this figure of 2 million per square kilometer. Of course, density is a very important factor, but also what we're going to do within our ecosystem, within our urban system. How can we create a variety of ecosystems that range between the 20 and the 2 million? We saw that there. How can we increase our capacity of using system which is solar powered rather than a fuel powered system? In order to be able to differentiate between this ecosystem, we need to understand the difference, and which I mentioned before, between the autotrophic and the heterotrophic. So for a very simple way of looking at this, we have, cities are not just buildings. You say that cities are, not all the cities are heterotrophic, because there is large part of the cities are autotrophic. We have gardens, we have parks, we have vegetation, we have lawns, we have, right? But it's not quite true, because what we are doing with this autotrophic system think of what we do with parks in cities. We mow them using power. We collect the leaves every day so they look beautiful. We fertilize them. So every single activity we do to create the autotrophic system within cities are not really natural systems. So how can we move from that? Is it possible? Can we make our cities have serious and real autotrophic components? Can we do that? When you look at your research questions on the group who's doing the architecture part, try to think of how to emphasize that, how we can make it more efficient and more useful using autotrophic ecosystem. The other thing which we need to reduce is the idea of how much is going out. The refuse is, we use a lot of energy for either sewage or material or waste and so on. How can we reduce that? And not only reduce that, but just as nature does, can we use the microorganism either to fix nitrogen or do something otherwise in this waste in order to use it in a different way? There is a lot of work on that, and if you go on the in the library, you will have a lot of literature on the waste. But it just, we are not linking all our thoughts together. We just have all these people working separately, but it's you here who's creating and designing cities and systems and so on, who needs to be aware of all these efforts and try to link it all together. And you should start now. You should start working together and try to understand these different cycles. And that's how this unit structures in all these different elements, and we try to link it all together. While you have different exercises, we need you to look at each other's and what they try to do. There will be a lot of good ideas, and there will be groups who are not really interested and just do business as usual and answer their question without really trying to innovate or do something based on this understanding. Right. So the difference between the main ecosystem and the urban center, ecosystems, you can see that I just give you an example here of a man-made fuel-powered system, which is the heat goes out to about 4,000 kilocalories per square meter a year, and the reef organism or oyster system is much more relevant than reef actually, with 57 kilocalories per square meter per year. I'm trying to move quickly, so I just want time for discussion here. Right. A good way of looking at cities as well is to look at the ecosystem that is contained. Odom did very interesting work comparing a city with the lake. If you think of a lake, because the lake is contained, it has energy going into it, it has organisms, it has waste in many ways, but there is boundaries to it. So are cities. They have boundaries, there is energy and machinery and fuel and so on going into it, and there is waste going out of it. And it is interesting to see how we compare two systems like that. And if we do, we will get, so this is a lake here. This is a lake system. And you got all these figures moving into it. That's about kilocalorie per acre here. It's an imperial data here. So you can see here there are a lot of sunlight, no fuel at all, a lot of food going into that, but not processed, and then water. While a city, for example, would have sunlight, but mainly we based on fuel. Here you can see the figures is huge, and then the waste is here is minimum, just in water, while here if you can look at the figures here and multiply that by how many acre a city is, which is about a million, a city with a million population would have about 90,000 acre. So you can imagine the level of waste here. Anyway, I move quickly now to say, all right, we have all this data, and I hope you will read more about all these points I raised today. So how can we move forward? So that's what I refer to as integral system. How can we create integral system that similar to the integral systems in nature? So what is our guiding principle? The first one, that integral system, all integral system in nature, process energy through closed loops and multiple channels. And I refer to multiple channels in my last lecture when I talk about fragility and the network of pathways. Think of a city. Do we have that? Do we have multiple channels for everything? So if you would like, do you link transport in different way with, say, for example, freight transport and human transport, and we have always one system in each. So how can we integrate that? Is that possible? Can we integrate more of all our systems? Integral natural system also release energy in system in small increments. I give you some example. In a leaf, for example, it uses a lot of energy, but it doesn't release it all immediately. What a leaf does is to store it into a different form of starch or inside the leaf itself. We're using photosynthesis, of course, and then release it in a very small increment, so it lives for a long time and in a concentrated energy form. Our system don't do that. Think of any of our systems, a car, it uses a lot of energy, and we move it quickly, but we release it very quickly. So the release is so how can we create this storage of energy in our different systems? What should we do? I give you an example of a solar cells before. A solar cell, we use a lot of energy, but it is stored in it as technology and release very little energy. And so it is a sort of a successful storage element. Can we have a lot of innovations like this? What else can we do? We cannot keep talking about solar cells all the time, but I struggle to find other systems that would do that. There have been a very interesting development in materials, for example, when we're thinking of putting waste into the cavity of walls. So if we put waste into the cavity of walls and use microorganisms to work on this waste, it can create a certain way of nutrients that would be able to fill the cracks when it happens. So there are a lot of work around the world on doing different things, but it's all about, really, we need to create living systems, not a mono systems. It also maintains a steady state through negative feedback and permeable boundaries. So when we use the energy, it goes back in cycles, so it's through feedback loops. And permeable boundaries between systems is very important, because if it's not used here, it can use somewhere else. We start using some of that in, say, the networks, in which you can see you can send back energy through the system to other houses to use, and so on. So we become a little bit more permeable, but for example, we don't have any way of transformation of gas network to electricity network. I attended a couple of weeks ago a very interesting talk by the Minister of Energy. We're talking about how the problem in Victoria is mainly just how to make gas a little bit more the network of gas more usable for other things, and how can we transfer that between electricity and gas, because gas, surprisingly, is very expensive to transmit than electricity. So most of the price you pay, for example, for gas is for that transmission, not for the product itself. Integral system also store information in a decentralized genetic memory. That's a very far principle from us to deal with, because it move into the biological system.